final issue I'd like us to consider under this topic of the church as Christ's body is the subject of women's ordination. So women's ordination is a contested issue within the church. Some churches practice women's ordination and some churches do not. There's a couple of key texts that we need to look at when considering this matter. One of them is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 14, which says, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness." And then Paul says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." A second key text would be 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 36, or let's start at 34. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or was it from you that the word of God came, or are you the only one it has reached? I would say those are the two primary passages that are at least jumpstart this conversation. So I think that there are a couple of key questions that we have to ask when considering this matter. The first one is, are these texts to be read as situational or universal directives? That is Paul laying down a policy that is universal and permanent in scope? In other words, this is the way it is meant to be. I mean, let's just start with this. Very clearly, the two passages that we have considered are closing the door on women's ordination. So let's just start there. The question, though, is that meant to be universally applied in a permanent way, or is Paul giving this directive because of the local situation? So if Timothy, the book of Timothy, the Timothy passage, Timothy is in Ephesus, Corinthians is Corinth, of course. So is there something happening in Ephesus? Is there something happening in Corinth which means that for this particular time, in this particular situation, Paul's closing the door? So are they universal or are they situational? So I would say that that's one key question. Well, I'm going to give you my thoughts. I think they're situational. I don't believe that these are universal directives. And I think what we have happening are some local issues, but we also have the culture in general, which would make putting women in leadership a bit of an uphill battle just culturally. But what I think let me talk about the local issue in Ephesus, what it could be. Now, there is a couple, and I apologize that I've forgotten what their names are, but they've written some books, a husband and wife team, both of them biblical scholars. They've written some books on this passage, and they make what for me is a compelling case anyway, that there's something going on in the pagan worship within Ephesus that has to do with a pagan cult that is kind of a little bit Jewish, a little bit Christian, and this particular cult is led by women. And part of their belief system is a reversal of the Genesis narrative, where the claim is that Eve was created first and then Adam. So it's kind of a feminist cult, I guess. And so when Paul writes in 1 Timothy 2, verses 13 and 14, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, and so on. He's not invoking the natural order of things, and therefore arguing it's unnatural for a woman to be in authority. He is addressing what is happening in this local situation. However, because of this local situation, it would be difficult and provocative to have women in ordained leadership in that context as long as that cult was an issue, because people would make associations and link the two together. So he's putting a prohibition as not as a permanent thing, but as an act of wisdom, I suppose, in this particular situation. And I think that there are some compelling arguments in that direction. As to the 1 Corinthians 14 passage, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they should be in submission, as the law says, and so on. Many scholars consider this passage as referring to some logistical issues in the local church. So, in the ancient world, typically, women did not attend the synagogue, or at least not on a regular basis. So now you have the Christian church in which women are attending worship. If women did attend the synagogue, when they did attend, they would sit apart from the men. And this was just a part of the cultural expression. So it is believed that as the church begins to meet so as not to cause scandal in the culture, the men and the women are seated separately. Perhaps the women are behind, perhaps the women are in the next room with an open door, or the women are up in a balcony, I don't know. But the women and the men are seated separately. And the whole thing is new to women because they've not been a part of public worship in a regular way as a part of their experience. And then some have argued that the term to speak here, women should be silent, they shouldn't speak, is not the normal word for speaking. Speaking as in, I'm speaking, up at the front speaking, as being the speaker. But it has more the sense of whispering or chatting. So what's going on here is perhaps the women are talking to one another. What's going on? What does that mean? Or in some cases, they're talking to their husbands, right? If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. Well, the presumption is that maybe they're asking their husbands there during the service, except they're across the room. Hey, Harry, what does that? Well, you can see how that would be disruptive. So the situational argument is not a prohibition against women speakers, but against a logistical issue. Now, why would we say that? Well, one reason why we would say it is that in the very same book, 1 Corinthians, Paul makes reference to the daughters of Philip who prophesy. Well, that would presumably include speaking in church, right? And speaking in some kind of authoritative or preaching way. You also have the husband and wife team, or should I say the wife and husband team, what's her name? I was going to say the two people that got killed, but I don't mean them. The two good people. What are their names? Priscilla and Aquila, right? And whenever Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned, Priscilla is always mentioned first. And they are itinerant teachers. And her being mentioned first is indisputably, I think, a reference that she's the primary teacher. So I think that there is evidence in the Bible that we do have women in ministry. In the last chapter of the book of Romans, there is reference to a female apostle. Paul says, greet these apostles, and one of the names is a female name. So I think that there is evidence of women taking leadership in the church. Let's go back to the Timothy passage for a minute. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. Well, that sounds, in our day and age, that sounds like a door closing, doesn't it? But let's put ourselves in Paul's day. If we put ourselves in Paul's day, this is actually a door opening. Because Paul is living in a day when women did not learn. Women didn't go and learn and be trained and taught. Women didn't go to school. So for Paul to say, let a woman learn, that is a massive door opening. Now we zero in on quietly and with all submissiveness. Well, that's how the men were to learn too. The men were to learn quietly and in submissive. This is talking about a teachable spirit. It doesn't talk, you can't ask questions. In fact, that's the primary way of learning, was asking questions. That's how rabbis and disciples learned. They learned by asking questions. Quietly here, it doesn't have to do with, silence as much as it does with a peaceful, quiet heart that is open, submissive learning. Not a busy heart, not a noisy heart, but a listening heart, a submissive heart. We have the story of Mary and Martha, right? Martha's in the kitchen, busy, busy, busy. Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning. Now, usually the lesson that comes out of that, if you've ever heard this preached, is, don't be a busy Martha. And, the application is usually, have your devotions before you get too busy. Don't be so busy that you don't have time to be with Jesus like Mary. Well, that's okay. That's an application. But the real breaking news is that you have a woman, Mary, sitting at the feet of a rabbi. That's the breaking news here. That was new. So here we have Jesus he's opening things up. So I think there's a couple things happening in the New Testament. On the one hand, you see things are opening up for women. On the other hand, there are still situations and issues that there's a glass ceiling for women because of local circumstances and situations. But I think that the trajectory of the New Testament is towards the full inclusion of women in ministry.